Picture this: the soft, measured sound of shoes moving across polished wooden floors. Not rushing, never rushing. The faint creak beneath your feet, as if the building itself is aware you're there. The air smells different here. New fabric, real leather, furniture polish worked deep into solid wood. Clean, but warm. Reassuring. You lift a coat from the rail and feel its weight settle into your hands. Heavy in a good way. The kind of weight that says this won't fray, won't warp, won't let you down. Nearby, kettles sit in neat lines, cool to the touch, dense, purposeful. Built to be used every day for years without complaint. This wasn't shopping, it was trust, quietly exchanged. And if you remember this, you already know John Lewis meant something. In post-war Britain, when things were still repaired rather than replaced, John Lewis found its place naturally. This was a country rebuilding itself slowly, carefully, with an instinctive suspicion of anything flimsy or overpromised. People wanted things that lasted because they had to. Money was considered, purchases were deliberate, and trust mattered. John Lewis fit that world perfectly. It didn't shout. It didn't chase trends. It offered quiet confidence, the sense that whatever you bought today would still be doing its job years from now. You paid once, and you paid properly. Today, the world moves faster. Price is everything. Speed beats certainty. Items are designed to be replaced, not relied upon. Which raises the uncomfortable question: how did something built entirely on trust lose its soul? For generations, John Lewis was woven quietly into ordinary British life. Not as a treat, not as a gamble, but as a certainty. You went there when something mattered. When you needed a sofa that would see children grow up and leave home. When you chose a kettle you expected to boil water every morning for the next 20 years. Bedding that survived endless washes. Irons that felt heavy, dependable, almost indestructible. Parents bought without hesitation. There was no second guessing, no lingering doubt. You didn't stand in the aisle comparing reviews or worrying about returns. Those thoughts simply didn't exist. If it came from John Lewis, it would work. And if it didn't, it would be put right. That was the real product on offer. Not furniture or appliances, but expectation. The quiet certainty that once you carried something out of those doors, your part was done. Quality, back then, announced itself without needing a label. You felt it first. Thick fabrics that resisted your fingers, stitching that ran straight and tight, seams that did not pull when you gave them a gentle test. Furniture made from real wood, not something pretending to be, with a weight that made you adjust your grip when you lifted it. Nothing felt hollow, nothing felt rushed. The staff moved differently too, calm, unhurried. They did not hover or sell, they explained. A hand would rest on a rail of coats while they talked you through the difference between linings. A kettle would be lifted, turned, its base tapped lightly as someone pointed out why this one lasted longer than the rest. There was no script, no urgency. You would stand there, running fabric between your fingers, listening. Decisions were made slowly, quietly. At the counter there was no pressure to hurry, just a nod, a receipt folded carefully, a sense that this small exchange had been done properly. Never knowingly undersold. It was not a slogan in the modern sense. It was not there to be clever or catchy. It was a promise. A moral contract between the shop and the people who walked through its doors. It did not mean John Lewis was cheap. Often, it was not. What it meant was honesty, that the price reflected the quality, that you were not being fooled, rushed, or quietly shortchanged. You paid a little more, and in return, you stopped worrying. That line carried weight because it was backed up year after year by things that lasted. But promises like that are fragile. They only work while every decision behind the scenes still believes in them. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, that belief began to bend. The world around John Lewis was changed, whether it liked it or not. Global supply chains promised lower costs, new competitors appeared,
faster and louder. Online retail rewrote expectations almost overnight. Customers began to compare prices with a tap of a finger, not a walk across town. And quietly, a tension formed. Quality takes time. Time costs money. Craft, testing, and durability do not fit neatly into spreadsheets built around speed and margin. None of this arrived with a bang. There were no dramatic announcements, no public reversals of principle. Instead, there were small decisions. A supplier changed here. A specification adjusted there. A material was swapped for one that looked the same but did not quite behave the same. On the surface, nothing seemed different.
The floors were still polished. The slogan was still on the wall. But beneath it, something had started to shift, so gently that most people did not notice at all. At first, it was easy to dismiss. A coat that didn't quite hold its shape after a winter. A kettle that needed replacing sooner than expected. Small things easily blamed on bad luck. But then, it happened again. And again. The changes weren't dramatic, just persistent. Fabrics felt thinner. Weight disappeared. The quiet reassurance you used to feel when lifting something from a shelf wasn't always there anymore. Returns became more common. Conversations at the counter shifted from confidence to explanation. People started keeping receipts, just in case. That alone would have seemed unthinkable years earlier. John Lewis had never been a place where you bought with one eye on failure. Customers began to sense it before they could fully explain it. Something wasn't right. The prices still suggested quality, but the experience no longer guaranteed it. And slowly, uncomfortably, that familiar line on the wall began to sound different, never knowingly undersold. Not broken perhaps, but no longer unquestioned. Inside the stores, the change was felt as much as it was seen. Staff who once took pride in knowing their products inside out were given less room to use that knowledge. Decisions were narrowed. Targets appeared where judgment had once lived. The job became more about throughput than understanding, more about numbers than reassurance. For customers, the shift was subtle but unsettling. The old certainty faded. Shopping at John Lewis began to feel like shopping anywhere else. You compared, you hesitated, you checked alternatives on your phone while standing in the aisle. That quiet confidence, the feeling that the decision had already been made for you, was gone. Nothing had completely failed. Most things still worked. The lights still came on. The doors still opened. But something harder to name had slipped away. It still worked, but it no longer felt right. And once that feeling appears, it is almost impossible to ignore. There was no day when the doors closed or the signs came down. No headline announcing the end of an era. John Lewis didn't collapse. It carried on. And that was part of the problem. The real moment came quietly, in thousands of small, private thoughts, said almost apologetically, "It's fine, but it used to be better." A sentence repeated in kitchens, in car parks, in passing conversations that never sounded angry, just disappointed. The shop still stood. The products still lined the shelves, but the meaning had thinned. What had been a place of certainty became a place of comparison. Not bad, not broken, just ordinary. And when something built on trust becomes ordinary, the loss isn't dramatic. It is invisible. You only notice it once it is already gone. John Lewis survived. In a retail landscape where so many familiar names vanished, that alone counts for something. The business adapted. Systems became leaner. Operations more efficient. Online platforms improved. From the outside, it looked competent, professional, modern. But survival came with a cost. The sharp edges were smoothed away. The things that once made it unmistakable, irreplaceable, became harder to spot. What remained worked well enough, but it no longer stood apart. It no longer felt necessary. This is the quiet trade-off modern Britain has made again and again. To stay alive, you let go of what made you special. You keep the doors open, but something essential stays behind. John Lewis didn't fail.
it endured. And in doing so, it became just another place to buy things, rather than a place you trusted without thinking.
Picture a winter evening in Britain around the year 1850. Gas lamps flicker to life along narrow streets. Inside cramped homes, families gather close to the fire, sharing what little warmth they can. The day is ending for most, but for thousands of others, it is only just beginning. Beneath the cobblestones, in alleys thick with smoke, inside factories that never truly sleep, men, women, and children prepare for work most people never saw and preferred not to think about. Jobs so dirty, dangerous, and degrading that they were barely spoken of, even at the time. Work that kept cities functioning, industries moving, and the wealth of Victorian Britain flowing upward, while those who did it remained invisible. These were not heroes celebrated in newspapers, nor pioneers remembered in history books. They left no statues behind, often not even names. This is the story of Britain's forgotten jobs and the people whose lives were spent doing the work no one else would. By the middle of the 19th century, Britain was changing faster than it ever had before. Towns became cities almost overnight. Manchester, London, Birmingham, Leeds, their populations exploded as people poured in from the countryside, chasing wages and survival. But the infrastructure of these places lagged far behind the growth. There were no modern machines to clean streets, no electric pumps to move waste, no safety laws to limit hours or protect bodies. When industry needed something done and no tool yet existed to do it, people became the solution. Human labor filled every gap. If sewage had to be cleared, someone climbed down into it. If coal had to be hauled through spaces too small for carts, children were sent crawling into the dark. If factories needed constant attention through the night, shifts simply never ended. These jobs were not accidents. They were the direct result of rapid industrial growth, cheap labor, and a society willing to trade human suffering for progress. Some jobs were so unpleasant that even in an age hardened by poverty and death, they carried a special stigma. These were the roles passed down only when there was no other choice. There were the night soil men working after dark, hauling human waste from overflowing cesspits before it poisoned entire streets. They waded through filth with bare hands and shovels, breathing fumes that burned the lungs, paid just enough to keep hunger away. There were bone pickers scouring rubbish heaps and slaughterhouse yards at dawn, searching for scraps of animal bone to sell to fertilizer merchants. The work stank of rot and blood, and injuries were constant. In textile mills, scavengers, often children, crawled beneath running machinery to collect loose cotton. A moment's distraction could cost a limb or a life. In the chimneys above, climbing boys were forced into flues no wider than a man's shoulders, scraping soot until their skin blistered and their lungs blackened. On the streets, crossing sweepers worked from dawn to dusk, clearing a path through mud, manure, and refuse for a single penny. No contracts, no protection, no safety net. These jobs existed at the very bottom of society, but without them, Victorian Britain could not function. Before dawn, long before the city properly woke, a climbing boy would already be at work. He might be 8 years old, sometimes younger. His master would lift him towards the fireplace, press his small body into the blackened opening, and tell him to climb. Inside the chimney, there was no light, only heat, ash, and the sharp scrape of brick against skin. He climbed by, bracing his knees and elbows against the walls, inch by inch, coughing as soot filled his mouth and lungs. If he slowed, the master below might light a fire to force him upward. At the top, the boy emerged shaking, eyes streaming, skin raw and bleeding. By the end of the day, he might be sent up a dozen more chimneys. By the end of the year, his joints would already be deformed. Many never reached adulthood. Some became stuck and suffocated in the dark. Others developed cancers decades before doctors understood why. Their suffering was rarely recorded. They were replaced quickly, forgotten just as fast. For Victorian Britain, this was not cruelty in secret. It was simply how work was done. The people who filled these jobs were rarely those with choices. Poverty decided first, and society followed. Men took the heaviest labor when they could find it, but women and children made up a vast and essential part of Britain's hidden workforce. Children were valued precisely because they were small. They could fit where adults could not, under machines, inside chimneys, through narrow tunnels underground. Many began work before they could properly read or write. School was a luxury their families could not afford. Women worked long hours in mills, laundries and workshops, often while pregnant, often for lower pay than men doing the same tasks. Others took on invisible labor, cleaning, sorting, hauling, scavenging, work that left their bodies worn out and their names unrecorded. None of this was considered shocking at the time. It was normal. Survival left little room for outrage. The cost of this work was written directly onto the body. Injuries were constant and expected. Crushed fingers, broken backs, damaged lungs. They were treated as part of the job, not tragedies. If a worker could no longer perform, someone else took their place by the next morning. Life expectancy among the poorest workers was brutally short. Many never reached middle age. Those who survived carried lifelong damage, twisted spines from hauling loads too heavy, chronic coughs from breathing dust and soot, skin scarred by chemicals and burns. Illness spread quickly in overcrowded housing, made worse by exhaustion and malnutrition. There was no compensation, no healthcare, no safety net. Deaths at work were rarely investigated. A fall into machinery, a collapse in a sewer, a child lost beneath factory wheels. These were noted, if at all, in a single line of newsprint. Their suffering kept the machinery of Britain turning, and when they were gone, the work went on. These jobs did not vanish overnight, and they did not disappear out of kindness. They faded slowly, pushed aside by machines, laws, and changing economics rather than sudden compassion. As the 19th century progressed, new technologies began to replace the most dangerous forms of human labor. Mechanical sweepers, pumps, and improved factory machinery reduced the need for bodies in places no one should ever have been. At the same time, public pressure grew. Reports, scandals, and early reformers exposed conditions that had once been ignored. Laws followed, cautiously at first. Child labor was restricted, working hours were limited. Safety, for the first time, became a concern rather than an afterthought. Employers resisted, costs rose, but efficiency won. By the end of the century, many of these jobs were gone, not remembered, just replaced. There are no monuments to these workers, no plaques mark the chimneys where children climbed, or the cellars where men hauled waste in the dark. Their jobs disappeared quietly, and with them, the memory of the people who did them. History tends to remember inventors, factory owners, and reformers. It rarely remembers the hands that bled to make progress possible. Yet modern Britain was built on this labor, on bodies worn out long before their time. These jobs were forgotten because they were uncomfortable to remember, but they mattered, and so did the people who did them. If you pause to think about them now, even briefly, they are no longer invisible. These jobs did not vanish overnight, and they did not disappear out of kindness. They faded slowly, pushed aside by machines, laws, and changing economics rather than sudden compassion. As the 19th century progressed, new technologies began to replace the most dangerous forms of human labor. Mechanical sweepers, pumps, and improved factory machinery reduced the need for bodies in places no one should ever have been. At the same time, public pressure grew. Reports, scandals, and early reformers exposed conditions that had once been ignored. Laws followed, cautiously at first. Child labor was restricted, working hours were limited. Safety, for the first time, became a concern rather than an afterthought. Employers resisted, costs rose, but efficiency won. By the end of the century, many of these jobs were gone, not remembered, just replaced. There are no monuments to these workers, no plaques mark the chimneys where children climbed, or the cellars where men hauled waste in the dark. Their jobs disappeared quietly, and with them, the memory of the people who did them. History tends to remember inventors, factory owners, and reformers. It rarely remembers the hands that bled to make progress possible. Yet modern Britain was built on this labor, on bodies worn out long before their time. These jobs were forgotten because they were uncomfortable to remember, but they mattered, and so did the people who did them. If you pause to think about them now, even briefly, they are no longer invisible.